Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Brooke Mitchell, and today's webinar is Color Correction 3 Ways, my photo editing workflow with NatHab Expedition Leader and Pro Photographer, Charlie Reinertsen. Also, really quickly, if you're part of a photo club and would like NatHab to speak to your members about nature and travel photography, please drop your email and club name in the chat and I will get you in touch with our photo expedition director. Okay, back to the webinar. Charlie, thank you so much for being here today. Over to you.
Thanks for the introduction, Brooke, and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining to talk about some pretty technical photo editing workflow considerations. I have a feeling we're going to talk about more than 3 ways to color correct photos, and I would like to leave a significant portion at the end to be able to answer questions and have this be a back and forth. So please submit questions as we go. Right now, I'm calling in from snowy Saranac Lake in Adirondack Park. And a lot of my photography that we'll be looking at today to be able to look at examples of how to edit photos is from all over the world. The stuff that we'll look at today is primarily from Adirondack Park. Looking at these photos, I'm trying to see, I think there are a couple from New England as well. I guide trips with Natural Habitat Adventures in Grand Teton National Park and Yellowstone National Park, as well as on the monarch butterfly migration in Michoacan, Mexico. And finally, a new trip that I'll be guiding this year is on the coast of Maine, exploring areas like Acadia National Park. And so some of these pictures are places that you could potentially explore similar habitats on a Natural Habitat Adventures trip. But today, I've done photography webinars in the past that have looked at different aspects, and for the most part, we haven't touched on how I color grade photos. So all these photos we're going to be looking at raw. This is what the photo looks like straight out of the camera. Just before we dive into the mechanics of how to actually adjust color in the photo, I just wanted to mention that I'm always shooting in raw photo file formats. That's just going to retain more information. It's going to give you a much better ability to be able to manipulate color once you get to this phase in the process. The other thing that I'm doing is I'm trying to shoot in as neutral of a color profile as possible. A lot of cameras will have different color profiles that you can assign that will put a color treatment onto the pixels themselves. So I'm always trying to avoid that. I always want to do all of my color correction in post because that gives me the greatest flexibility. Occasionally, if you select a really warm color profile on your camera settings, it can be really hard to undo that through photo editing. So we're going to be looking today in Lightroom, which is an Adobe product. All of the mechanics of what we're doing is going to be possible no matter what program you are using. Even on your phone, we now have the ability to adjust pretty much all of these sliders, even just from our phones. So we're using Lightroom Classic in this tutorial. I much prefer Lightroom Classic because it's kind of like the gateway to Photoshop, which is essentially a more powerful, more heavy-duty platform. For me, my workflow is really fast in Lightroom, and the only reason why I move over to Photoshop is if I have a photo that's been really challenging, where the color just isn't cooperating, I'll move over to Photoshop. Or if I'm printing something really large scale and I want to make sure that the way that I'm manipulating the image is really intentional and very specific, then I'm going to move over to Photoshop. So let's just get into it. I'm just going to go through the very, very quick steps here that I do before I go into color balance. So it's just setting your white and black point. If you look at the tutorial that I just did for NatHab a couple weeks ago, you'll get into kind of how I'm making my decisions about this, but right now I'm just going to adjust it. That looks about right for where I want to start on this image. Another thing that I usually like to do for an image like this that has sky is throw in a very quick, I mean, now there's the ability to detect sky, but I still kind of prefer just a linear gradient up at the top to be able to darken that. And usually I like to do that with highlights rather than exposure. Um, and I'm moving really quick here because this is not really the point of this talk. And then I want to throw another linear gradient because the bottom of this image is fairly dark. I just want to open that up just a little bit. So that's a good starting place. And something I'm noticing right now is that my greens are a little bit too green. They're too yellow, honestly. And then the blues in the spring in the center of the image, those feel too saturated to me. So one of the things you want to think about before you even start editing the photo is what's your objective? For me, my objective is always to try and create a true to life representation of a place. And I do that based on memory, which obviously that's subjective. It's not perfect. One of the ways that people are going to do color correction is by using what's called a color card. And essentially you take a picture of that card that has it has true white, true black, and then a number of different colors depending on the type of color card that you have. You take a picture of that in the field, and then in your editing platform, you can select the mid gray to be able to set the color balance for the whole shoot. The problem that I have with that is that I have to remember to take a picture of that card in the field, and it often gets in the way of trying to take pictures. The other thing that happens is that I'm usually shooting in the morning and the evening when the color that I'm experiencing is changing rapidly. So you might take a picture of your color card, and then in a half an hour, you need to take another picture of that color card because your lighting conditions have shifted. So to me, it's just not worth the hassle. If I'm doing a really technical project, then I'll use it, but it's not my go-to. I had somebody reach out to me this week as well before we really dive into these different methods. And they shared one of their methods, which I love, but it's kind of similar to the color card process, is that if you have a mirrorless camera, right now you're always experiencing your image through the sensor. So if you remember DSLR cameras before mirrorless, you're always looking at a mirrored image. It's not an actual look at what's happening on the digital sensor. So all to say, if you're using a mirrorless camera, you can do a custom Kelvin temperature to get what you're seeing in the viewfinder or on your screen to look as close to what you're seeing in real life as possible. So you're just kind of looking back and forth, adjusting the Kelvin, and usually you can use a little trackpad on your camera to be able to get the right things set. My problem with that is twofold. Once again, if I'm in the field, I want to take pictures. I don't want to spend time doing that. And then secondly, you need to repetitively do that because again, the light is changing so fast. You know, you can have clouds roll in and completely change the color temperature of what you're looking at. And so for me, often I'm setting my color balance on my camera to a manual 5500K, which is essentially daylight. And then from there, I come into my post-production process and I do what I'm about to do with all of you, which is color grading. So let's dive in. We just did some really coarse adjustments for exposure, where we adjusted the white and the blacks. We did some highlight and shadow manipulation, did a couple graduated filters. Now this is where we take a look at the temperature band right here on the right side of the screen, as well as the tint band. The temperature band is going to be between cool temperatures, which is sliding to the left, and warm temperatures, which is sliding to the right. when I first edit an image, I like to do this where I go back and forth. And then I just kind of slide to the right and to the left, and I'm trying to find a middle point where the colors look as natural as possible. To me, that's about there. And what I'm looking for, you can actually start to zoom in and go to a fairly neutral area of your image and do the same thing. Just go cool and go warm. And what I'm looking at is areas that shouldn't be orange or blue. If they start turning orange or turning blue, I'm going too far. So right now I'm going to move in the blue direction. And that mountain to me is getting too blue right there. And I'm looking at these clouds that are fairly bright, they're fairly white, and they got a little bit too blue about there. At on the right hand side, you can read it. It's 4,300 Kelvin. And versus on the warm side, it really starts to overtake the image if I go up into 5,200. So again, this is a very coarse adjustment. We're not doing fine tune color correction, but for the purposes of this, if you're just doing a cursory, I want to move quickly and edit this photo, to me, that warm cool balance is about right. Next, I'm going to take a look at the green magenta. And if I pull it down here, it looks terrible. It's all green. Pull it over here, it's magenta. So you can double click on that just to reset as it was shot, or you can go here and say as shot if you don't remember where you started. So again, I just kind of cooled that image down. And then here, to me, everything's a little bit too green. So I want to bring in a little bit of that magenta. And this is an interesting place where some ecological knowledge can actually help with your photo editing, because I know that a lot of this landscape is sphagnum moss, and that's the red color that we're getting coming through. That's not what we call an artifact of the lens. So every once in a while, cameras can have malfunctions, essentially, where they're reading a color that actually isn't there. So every once in a while with color correction, you want to get rid of that or dial that down to try and make it look more natural. In this instance, that's a real color that's actually happening in the world. So I want to keep it. So that's the first way to do color correction, is with these two sliders. Again, it's kind of broad strokes. It's not very specific. And to me right now, the area around the spring is undersaturated and the spring itself is oversaturated. So that tells me that I want to work with HSL. HSL stands for hue, saturation, and luminance. And it's this very intimidating swath of panels down here. What I'd recommend, if you've never used this before, is go in and play with it. See what happens when you drop red hue all the way down, all the way up, zoom in to a portion of the image, and do the same thing. I brought it down, bring it up, see what the change is. You're going to notice, I'll show you what happens when I do that with blue. This image needs to be fixed when it comes to the blue, to my eye. So right now you can change the hue just of your blue by doing this. And if you're looking, every change that I make when I'm editing a photo, I'm always looking at the histogram to see what I'm doing and how it's interpreted in the histogram. So right now you're seeing I'm changing the blues in the image to either to shift into a different hue. All right. So going down to saturation, this is where I would like to bump the saturation down in blues. But the problem is this spring is a little bit oversaturated, but the sky is a little bit undersaturated now that I dropped that down. So you want to create a mask. And remember, we already created a mask that we were changing the exposure. We dropped the highlights down. For me, I kind of want that sky to be a little bit more rich. So I can take this color band, which is specific to that mask that we created, that red area, And I'm just going to cool that down a little bit. To me, that looks a little bit better. You can even do a tiny bit of a boost of saturation. And to me, that's a little bit more to what I was experiencing on that day. So we're just going to go back into the main slider, main panel here, just to give you a little tour of Lightroom Classic. The way it's organized, this far left icon that I'm hovering over is kind of the main panel where you can see all of these different editing tools. This is the crop tool, or if you needed to make an adjustment to the aspect. Here is, kind of doing spot removal, or if you have dust on your sensor, kind of removing that. And then this far right one would be for your filters. So you can add a lot of different types of filters. And this is an area where there are a lot of new ones coming out that are using AI to be able to select the subject or select the sky, select the background. For me, I love to work with linear gradients and radial gradients for the most part, because that's the history of photography. That's the tools that we would use in the darkroom. With that said, every once in a while, the sky selection tool is a really great tool to be able to use. All right, so that was just a little aside. Now we're going back, and I want to take a look at HSL again. So remember my critique of this photo. I really like what's happening here with the sun on the hillside. There's this really nice kind of bright swath coming in. I feel like the peatland, that's this ecosystem. This entire flat area is a bog. I feel like it's undersaturated, this whole area here. And so one of the ways that I can do that is I can grab this tool right here. You click on that kind of up arrow, down arrow, and circle in the center next to saturation. And I'm going to go in close to the image and select a color, and you can bring it down in saturation or you can bring it up in saturation. So obviously we don't want to go too extreme here, but if I wanted to edit the color that way, I could come in here, boost the saturation just a smidge, and start to get that color to look a little bit more natural to what I saw and experienced on that day. Again, it's subjective. Someone else who looks at my photo might say, hey, that's way oversaturated, or it's undersaturated, or it's too green, too magenta. This is something where we're all developing our personal taste around it. And it kind of depends on the subject matter, what you're doing, to be able to really get an image that you're happy with. So uh, I'm not thrilled with how the color is looking here, so I'm just going to reset the saturation bars. I've learned when I'm shooting a peatland, for some reason, just the way that my camera sensors are, I always end up changing the hue of orange down just a little bit. I bring the saturation of orange up just a little bit, and the luminance of red down just a hair. And you'll see those micro adjustments. This is the original image, which is really not helpful to look at this point. And this is the edited image here. But those little tiny adjustments brought a little bit more saturation to this area. If I wanted to, I could mask out the spring and kind of address that. But the other thing I can do is just bring the luminance of blues down as well as the saturation down. And if you look at the hue of the blue, I can give it a little bit more of a purple tone that's going to contrast a little bit more with the peatland itself. I'm still not thrilled with this, and you're starting to see that for an image that I'm really excited about, I'm going to edit color for way too long. It's going to take me a really long time to get this dialed, and if I'm honest, this is the type of image that I'm probably going to take into Photoshop and do some pretty extensive work with. Before we look at another photo, I want to show you another tool. So often I use an ergonomic mouse. This happens to be a Logitech. And part of the reason for that is when you're doing this type of editing, you're clicking and dragging and using your fingers a lot. So if you're going to get into photo editing, it's really important to make sure you're like in a comfortable position with good ergonomics, because if you spend too long doing this, you're going to start to develop some hand problems. Another tool that you can use, this is what's called a loop deck, or it's one product called, the company is called Loop Deck. I have no sponsorship with them whatsoever. This is just one example of a console you can use to edit photos. Essentially, in this particular mode that I have it in, let me go back down to HSL. And so what I can do here is I can actually adjust, right now I'm adjusting the red with a physical dial, and then I can reset it by clicking in. This makes photo editing so much more fun. This is not cheap to be able to get one of these units, and there are a lot of different companies that make things like this. But if you're really tired of clicking with a mouse, it can kind of bring the creativity and the fun back into your workflow. So I highly recommend it. Let's take a look at another photo. This is a scan of a leaf. So I used a high resolution scanner to scan essentially an inch by inch area of a maple leaf. And so one of the things that we run into with color in this is that the surface of a leaf is very waxy, and it gives you the perception that your image isn't actually crisp, even though this is basically as crisp as you could possibly get. And a lot of the time, the way that I'm going to make an image more crisp is by editing the color. Obviously, you can do some things with contrast. I think this one needs a little bit less of an exposure. Get the whites and the blacks in the right place. Bring your highlights down. To me, this is a little bit too much saturation, but just for the purposes of this, I'll show you for white balance, a scanner is going to come in really neutral. But to me, this feels just a smidge too warm, so I'm just going to cool it down a little bit. And on the green-red balance, I think we need to put it about there. I'm sorry, there's a little background noise of my dog playing with a toy. But thanks for your patience. So then down here, we're back into HSL. And for me, the dials that would be really interesting to take a look at would be the green and the yellow. One other thing that really impacts the way that we perceive color is this tool here called, in the presence panel of Lightroom Classic, the dehaze tool. Basically, that's going to darken the dark parts and lighten the light parts and just kind of create a crisper, more, you can kind of think of it as an alternative to using contrast. But to me, these adjustments that we just did made a big difference, but I still feel like the reds are a little bit much right now. So I'm actually going to look at the luminance of that area and see how if I bring it up, it's super bright. This is natural, but I'm going to bring it down just a smidge. And orange, I'm going to bring down just a little bit. Yellow, I'm curious what that does. And I think I like just a little bit there. So with this instance, if I still had this leaf, if I was editing this in 2015 when I took this picture, gosh, it might have even been 2013, I could hold the leaf up next to my screen and adjust things and really get it dialed in well. But ultimately, it's a judgment call to try and get it to where you're happy. I wanted to share this example because this is an instance where I'm shooting through some foliage to be able to get this shot of a garter snake. And that foliage is casting a green hue across the image. And so for me, I'm interested in kind of cooling this down a little bit. And I also think it would benefit from a little bit more in the magenta hue. I don't want to lose that green hue that's happening, especially in the lower left corner of the image, because I think it's kind of cool to give you that feeling that you're looking through some leaves to be able to see this animal. But this is another example of when I might want to do some HSL grading. in particular, to me, the hue of the yellow um, just isn't that pleasing to me. I felt like this is just way too lime green, and I think that's actually an artifact of, not an artifact. I think the leaves are reflecting some of their green on the scales of the snake. And to me personally, I just don't like that color very much. I like it better as more of a yellow or an orange, which is a little bit truer to the color that I know this snake was. So just those adjustments. I don't think it needs much more than that. The other thing I'd consider is brightening up the eye. And as you're seeing, I'm starting to shoot with the Z8, the Nikon Z8, and it's like a completely different art form. This is a macro lens, 100 millimeter macro, and the detail is just absolutely insane. Like I'm still just like thrilled about this. But if I were to throw just a little radial gradient, I would just put it right over the eye. I'd bring the highlights contrast up, and I like the idea of the blacks being more rich and the whites being a little bit brighter. And what that's going to do is draw your attention to that eye. So if we look at the before and after, on the left is the before, and the way that I got into this window is by hitting Y on the keyboard. So you can see I've kind of toned the greens down. I just made some really micro adjustments. You can zoom in, and this is where you're starting to see how I've cooled the image down. I've gotten some of those greens out of there by bumping the magenta up. And to me, I've kind of made that eye a little bit more crisp. The other thing we can do, again, dehaze is going to be your friend, and a little bit of clarity. So that's another example. It's kind of interesting to look at. Another place where color gets challenging is when you start using flash photography, or if you're using an external light source. In this instance, I was using a headlamp. So color balance gets a little bit more challenging. You have to remember what the organism looked like. To me, this is fairly accurate, but ultimately I want to warm that up and think about getting a little tiny bit more in the magenta area. But this is a spotted salamander on one of our big night migrations here in the Adirondacks. This is using an on-camera flash. And to me, I'm really happy about the color, but I feel like the pine needles are oversaturated in how this came out. I think that the salamander itself is really true to color, but the pine needles just with the flash, something about that dynamic just it made that tone way too much. So this is an instance where you can really just grab saturation and take a look at this color and just bring it down a hair. And to me, the color there, when I brought the saturation down, it just made it a little bit off. So I'm actually going to play around with the hue as well on that, maybe with yellows, and just try and get to a place where this is a little bit more natural. And as you can see, I'm not using hard and fast rules. I don't have one particular process. I'm just getting in here, and in some ways I'm painting with light. I'm trying to, and the rule of thumb as well, I really jumped into color right away. You should really set the exposure of the image before you jump in to doing what I was just doing. But I think the overall exposure should come up, whites should come down. I'm not crazy about that. The reflection, you can actually see my camera and the light apparatus in his eye and on his eyelid right there. But to me, that feels a little bit better than the original image, which was a little bit oversaturated, given that I was using flash. I would still do some playing around because I don't feel like those pine needles are quite a natural color yet, but that's kind of the direction that I would go. Another place that gets really challenging is if you're photographing things that are just below the surface of water. So this is a grayling fin taken in Grand Teton National Park, actually in the Gros Ventre Wilderness. And one of the things that's going to be really helpful here is color manipulation, as well as that tool that we were using earlier, which was the dehaze tool. So I just want to bring those highlights down, bring the contrast up. In this instance, I think the image is a little bit too bright for the content. But when we get dehaze, that's where you're starting to cut back some of that glare from the fish itself. And this is an instance where, to me, I'm trying to accentuate just how insane these fins are when they have that iridescent glow when they're subsurface. If you ever have a chance to see a grayling fin, it's just amazing to be able to see. So that's what I would do for editing, but then I want to show you one more way. So this is the color grading panel of Lightroom Classic. And I'm actually going to bump over here to this image to show this, and I'm going to reset the whole image so that it's going to do auto for the exposure. Let's go down here. When you have a landscape photo, one of the ways that can be pretty pleasing and quick to color grade is to play with these. And what I would go to is the highlights, try and warm those up a little bit, and the shadows, cool those down. Because often our eye, it's always interpreting. Our eyes, like in our brains really, are constantly interpreting the world around us. If you ever have the experience of being in the dark and coming out into a bright area and your eyes adjust, the color, if you pay attention to the color of the scene, also changes. And of that, another thing to note is the color of your room as you're editing. I know that if my room is really warm, warmly lit with a warm temperature light, I'm going to edit my photos in a way that's not going to be neutral. It's going to skew. Often it'll skew warm in a warm room. So it's important to kind of create some natural light in the room that you're editing, and to have your desktop entirely be a mid-gray. So you can set your background to mid-gray. That's why Lightroom has mid-gray as the default in the background here behind the image, is because it's trying to give you, as an accurate color balance as possible for you to be able to move through this. Now, I wasn't crazy about how that looked. It's just another tool. Not every image is going to look great. Play around with having the highlights be cool and the shadows be warm. The midtones are going to be really dramatic in how they react. This is, again, the HSL bands are going to be really granular, and these color grading circles are going to be kind of broad strokes and kind of aggressive in how they're applied. So I would never come out. I would always try and keep it super close to the middle. And some images are going to work well with that, and some of them are not. So we did underwater, took a look at that. This is shooting through the window of a high-wing plane. So you're going to get glare, which can also impact how colors are perceived. Also, when you're shooting from a plane, you have atmospheric interactions that are causing color to come out differently. So in this instance, on this shot, to me, the magentas are just too strong. So like clearly, let's just do a really quick edit here to be able to get that back. That looks okay. So to me, it just needs to be a little bit more green to feel natural. And this, to me, also feels like the balance on the blue, orange is fairly good. The other problem that we're having here is that this plane is yellow, and that's also going to play into how our eyes are perceiving the rest of the image. So that's just something to take into consideration. If you ever hire a high-wing plane, try and get a plane that has white struts and underside of the wing, and that'll help you with the color balance in the images afterwards. Let's see. Another image, macro lenses have the ability to make really small things really big. And sometimes that can be a challenge for color production. Next week on Friday, I'll be leading a webinar on camera traps and how to use a camera trap to be able to capture wildlife photography. In particular, I'll be focusing on the Nikon Z8 and Z9 because Nikon just released this technology that's called auto capture that turns your camera into a camera trap. So it's really neat. Mostly, in the past, you would always have to buy all these external shutter releases and flashes and all these different apparatus, custom rigs to be able to turn your large camera into a camera trap. And now Nikon just released the software that's making it really easy. So I'm going to talk about that next week. And this picture was taken using auto capture. So I was using a macro lens. I had set up a camera trap to be able to get super close shot of a blue jay. Oops, I keep hitting the wrong thing here. So what I wanted to show you is that blue jays are really interesting when we think of color, because blue jays have structural color. The physical structure of their wings is causing us to perceive them as blue. They don't actually have blue pigmentation in their wings. So I wanted to get a super close-up picture that would kind of like make you feel like the texture of the wing is responsible for the color, because I loved that ecological story. To me right now, this is just a very dark image, but it also feels fairly close to how I think of a blue jay wing. It's showing up super high contrast right now, and part of that is because I was using an LED continuous light for this setup. And so it's just kind of coming through in a fairly harsh way. I could bring the contrast down if I wanted to counteract that a little bit. But right now, to me, like, I'm looking at the whites, and I don't want to make them too warm, but I also don't want them to be over cool. So that's why I'm just playing here. And to me, this image doesn't need a whole lot more than that. As you can see, I've cropped in significantly to that image, and the detail is still holding up. So let's take a look at another image. I wanted to show an example of an instance where you capture something that's heavily underexposed. So in this instance, I was shooting at low light conditions in the evening, and I really wanted to get this picture because it was kind of like that first snow. It was just a moment that wasn't going to happen otherwise. But as you can see, I was wide open on the f-stop, f2.8. And any slower of a shutter speed, and I would have started to detect some, lack of clarity from that. So this image already, it just definitely needs, to be much brighter. So I'm going to do some fairly big edits here to the exposure and protect the highlights a little bit here. But this image feels really cool, and that's because it was taken really late in the sunset. So I think it needs to warm up a bit. I know that these plants should be kind of this brown color. I'm going to bring that in. And then something else that affects how we perceive color in an image is how sharp the image is. And this is a noisy image because it was taken in such low light, and I just made some pretty big exposure adjustments. So I'm just going to smooth that out using the manual noise reduction. There's also a AI generated noise reduction button in Lightroom. I haven't done too much with that yet, but I think I'm gonna, I just wanted to show you a bunch of different types of images. I think this would be one that I would maybe think about using, warming up the highlights, cooling down the shadows. I think that could give it an interesting look. Again, this is all up to personal taste. It really comes down to your preference. This last image I wanted to throw in just because there are nitrogen fixing bacteria in our peatlands, and they create these areas that kind of look like oil spills. And this is totally flat out of the camera. what it looks like. And I wanted to show this because sometimes I'll take a contextual picture that has more of the surroundings so that I can see what the color looks like against something that I know what the color is. So for it, this is the shot that I wanted. I wanted just a super close up, interesting image of what looks like an oil slick, but is actually these nitrogen um, fixing microbes. But for me to edit this well, I kind of need a reference image of seeing what it looks like with the green sphagnum around it. So I would start with this image and try and get the color just right, and making sure that I protect the color of that sphagnum. Um, and then I could use these settings, plus 15, minus 14, and bring them over here to be able to see what that would look like. I never would have come to this conclusion, that I needed to end up at this color uh, on my own. But because I used that reference image back here, and that's basically what it looked like when I was physically there. You can actually do a command, select two images, and sync and check the different things that you want to synchronize for developing, and that's a way to kind of streamline your editing process. But I don't think I would have ended up here. And dehaze is going to be your friend anytime you have a really reflective image. So for me, this is more of an artistic image, and I think it's a little bit overexposed for the content. But I'm really excited to kind of dive. I haven't edited this batch of images yet, so I'll be publishing these pretty soon, and I'm pretty excited about that one. All right, we covered a ton of ground, and I want to save a good amount of time, so I'm going to leave this window up, but I'd love to take some questions and be able to answer any questions you might have.
Oh, thank you, Charlie, for that detailed explanation of color correction and all the different just tools that we have at our disposal in programs like Lightroom. So, everybody, yeah, we have some time now for questions. And feel free in your control panel in that questions field, feel free to send them in. We have a few, but we could definitely have time for more. So, don't be shy. If you have something for Charlie, we will get through your questions as many as we can. So let's start. We do have a couple questions about that really cool extra mouse track thing that you held up. Could you by chance hold that up again for everybody to see
Yeah.
and explain again what it was? I have a couple questions about it.
All right. So here's what we're looking at. I'm going to try and get an angle that doesn't have glare. They have a couple different models of this. This one, I chose it because this center dial is very satisfying to use. And then it has these individual dials on the side. So when it comes to color correction, the way that this one works is this particular panel, which there are basically like 8 preset panels that change what's available on this digital display. But panel three corresponds to this HSL panel on your computer. So here, let me see if I can get all of those color wheels in. So now you can see the hue, the saturation, and the luminance on the screen. And then in my video here, I'm going to show you how I manipulate them. So right now I'm selecting the orange and the yellows. So oranges will be controlled by these three dials, and yellows will be controlled by these three dials. So it says H is this dial on orange. So if you look at the top of my screen right now, I'm manipulating, or the red slider. Can reset it by clicking. And this is with the saturation, reset it by clicking. So there is a learning curve with this one. They have another one that's specifically designed for Lightroom that puts everything on a keyboard sized panel, and everything's manual. So rather than having to have all these submenus that are digitally accessed. And that's the learning curve, is kind of figuring out how to set this thing up. You can get one that's literally shows you all the colors as physical knobs that you can manipulate. I have a little buyer's remorse. I think I'd rather have that one. I got this one because this one can be used with video editing, but in reality, it's not that useful for that. So yeah, that tool is fairly helpful. But I'm only using it if I know I have to sit down for 2 hours, 3 hours and edit photos. I'll bust that out. If I'm doing a quick edit for 15 minutes, I'm just going to use my mouse. So it's not like the best thing ever, but it does help if you're somebody like me who's editing all the time.
And could you say again what it is called, Brandon, like its actual name?
Yeah, this one's called a loop deck, Loupedck. And this model, I think they have like two different models. This is the loop deck CT.
Perfect. There we go. That answers a couple questions in here. And we also have another request that your special mouse that was ergonomic. Could you also show that as well? And
Yeah, these are always
yeah,
the hot
all the
topics
tools.
of the webinars.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of ergonomic design. So this one's the Logitech, and it's the regular one. I think it's called MX Master 3S. Gosh, Logitech should be paying me money for this.
Right.
And this is their vertical version. So I'll rotate between the two because this puts my hand in a very different position than this. Down clicking versus side clicking. And if you're someone like me who's on a mouse for too many hours a day, it can be really helpful.
Yeah, that's amazing. I definitely need to look into those too, as also somebody who's on a computer for too many hours in the day. All right, let's move on from gear and let's get into some more questions about editing. So, could you explain luminance? It sounds like the person asking, they understand hue and saturation, but they don't necessarily understand luminance. Could you go into that a little bit further? What is it and what does it do when you're adjusting it?
So hue is adjusting the so it's selecting colors that are on a band between orange and green, kind of on this band here that I'm using my mouse to highlight. And you're actually changing the wavelength of those colors. So you're looking at this eye, and I take that color and I'm making it more orange versus more green. I'm going to reset that. Saturation. I don't know the technical terms for what it's desaturating the image. If you go this way, it's saturating it more. So it's making that color more rich than it was captured. Luminance is going to allow that color, just that color, to be exposed less or more. And this is one you have to be really careful with because you'll see, I'm going to zoom in even more just so that this shows up a little bit better. When you play with the yellow luminance, you get to a place where it just gets muddy if you go too far. And if you go too bright, you're actually removing any pigmentation from those areas because you're effectively overexposing that color band. So you have to be really careful with luminance. I really only use it in a light touch. Um, and one of the ways that's really helpful is when you do have an image with lakes or sky in it. I'm just going to touch the blue hue. I'm going to make it a little more magenta, slightly more saturated. But then when you get into luminance, this is going to do some crazy stuff. So you have to be really careful. But you can drop that down a little bit. You could even do an AI generated sky filter on this image, detect the sky. Right now it's grabbing just the sky. And then you could go, oh shoot, I thought you had the ability. No, that's separate. Um, I guess you can't do that. I feel like there's a workaround where you can get the ability to change the luminance of that area, but it's not coming to me right now. But that's the general premise to answer your question. Is luminance is how exposed the bright, like essentially the brightness of specific color bands. And if you look at the histogram, you can see what it's doing. It's taking those blue wavelengths and pushing them down and lower in the exposure of the image. I'm sure someone with more technical prowess would explain that better.
It made sense to me, so hopefully it did to everybody as well. But if not, please submit your further questions and we'll ask Charlie to continue down his thought process there. But this is another great question. So, what do you do when distant features have that blue cast where they're not supposed to look like that, but yeah, they're definitely blue?
Yeah, so let's see. This image is kind of an example of that where you end up getting this hazy blue. And this image isn't terrible. Like, I would get concerned if this hillside was more blue. Um, there are a couple different things you can do. I'll show you a couple ways to address that. One would be to get the brush and grab a size that makes you happy. And I'm just going to focus on this area here. One thing to remember with the brush is there's the size of the brush, which I'm manipulating right now. There's the feather, which is going to soften the edge of your effect. Let me give you a harsh feather. This is no feather. So you're just seeing it's like a really harsh edge. You want to make sure your feather is out quite a bit. Right now I've got it almost all the way up. And that's just going to make it so that whatever effect you apply isn't too dramatic. So I would create a filter like that. I would be really, if the image is really important to you, take your time and paint out uh, everything that's blue. But for the purposes of showing you, I'm just going to focus on this little area here. Um, and that's painted. Then you're going to come down and you're going to be really careful because you can do a lot of damage here. If I were to make it more blue, it'd be going down, go to the temperature slider, just bump up that temperature to a place that you feel is natural. That's too far, that's too orange, that's too far in the other direction. I think right about there is a more natural place. So that's how I would do it. The other way, I don't think there's a better way. I think that's the best way, is just painting with the brush feature and then adjusting the temperature that way. Great question.
Great, that was very helpful. Thanks for that. We did have someone just chime in and said that in the sky mask, you can adjust luminance and point color menu, by the way. So,
Interesting. Cool.
nice fun fact.
Good
Thank
to
you so
know.
much for that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, gonna have to play with that as well. So this is a good question. So when you were when you were like looking at the adjustments and looking at the histogram, what exactly were you looking at in the histogram? What was that information telling you as you were moving things around?
The histogram for me, well, I guess let's back up to the beginning for something that I didn't mention. One of the most important things you can do before you start color grading is calibrating your computer. I don't want to do a whole tutorial on that. Just Google your computer and how to create a neutral profile. And there will be a bunch of photography tutorials that'll guide you through how to set up your monitor so that it's reading colors accurately. Because different monitors can have different color profiles, and you want to be editing in one that is a natural, neutral color profile. So that's one. Two is that The brightness of your monitor can affect how you edit your images in the final output. So you can do another calibration of the brightness. You can even get devices that help you calibrate your computer. What I'd recommend for me, I'm on a Mac, which these computers tend to be way too bright for editing photos. Um, so I usually set my monitor brightness to 50% and then I edit photos that way to make sure, because if I edited photos at 100% brightness, I would be creating photos that in output would be too dark. So all of that aside, oh my gosh, Brooke, can you remind me of the question? I know I was planning on getting there, but I forgot.
When you were adjusting things around, you were talking about the histogram and making sure that you're paying
Yes, yes,
attention to
yes,
the
yes.
histogram. So, what about it are you looking for when you're checking that out?
Mostly a couple things. Let me show you what happens when I create a high contrast image. See how it's that histogram. What I look for in a histogram is a nice bell shape. And usually I want that bell shape in the middle. But occasionally, artistically, that's not going to happen. Maybe I was really interested in creating an image that's really low key. So I would bring my whites up, bring the exposure down, and this is a really big, dramatic photo of a snake. So sometimes you want a histogram that has the bell curve shifted down into the shadows. But for me, the histogram is kind of like a gut check, right? Like you want to look at it to be able to say, am I really out of bounds here in how I edited this photo? Is it going to show up well in different platforms? Should I adjust it? But one of the biggest things that the histogram is doing, I'm going to engage the darks, the whites and the white and black point. So these carrots up here, right now I selected them. So when you select them, areas that are blown out, either too dark and have no information or too bright and thus have no information, are either going to be red or blue. So blue is where we've lost information because it's too dark. So like in this eyeball, and red is where we've lost information because it's too bright. So that means that once you've edited an image, you should always start by setting the white and black points so that you don't have those areas. But sometimes when you're doing things like dehaze, it's going to make the dark parts darker and the light parts doesn't affect them as much. Really, it's playing with the dark. But sometimes you have to go back again. So at the end of editing, I'll look at that histogram. If you have any information that's clipped or too far, it's off the scale, there's literally nothing that's being printed in that area. So if you're printing this, say you're doing a big banner, and you go to print this image that has a lot of blown out highlights like this, anything that's red right now literally has no information. So the printer won't even put pigment in that area. Say you're printing on like a gray canvas, you're going to see that whole area is going to be gray because there's no pigment over the top. So that looks so bad. Let me just reset it because it's bothering me. Um, but that's why I'm looking at the histogram. It's a gut check to make sure things look good, and it's also checking to make sure that you don't have any blown out areas of the image.
That was very helpful. Thank you. And we have come to the end of the right there it goes, right at the end of the hour. So, Charlie, I will turn it to you for any last closing comments.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining. I know this was a highly technical webinar. If you'd like to check out more of my work, you can go to twoline.com, and you can go over to portfolio, and there's all kinds of photo libraries there from all around the world to be able to check out my work. If you're interested in any of my prints, everything is, I can do some custom print orders for any of those items. And thank you so much for tuning in. I hope that you learned something. And if you want to share something with me, I'm constantly changing how I do this. There's no right or wrong way to edit photos. But I find that seeing how other people do it. I'm always picking up new tricks. So feel free to send things my way. And my email is charlie@twolined.com. If you go to twolined.com, you'll be able to get in touch. So thank you so much. And see you next week, Friday, if you're interested in taking a look at some camera trap photography.
Perfect. Thank you so much for taking the time to present to us today, Charlie. And I'd like to thank everybody who tuned in. Remember, if you are a part of a photo club and would like NatHab to speak to your members about nature and travel photography, please email us at webinars@nathab.com. Join us Monday for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out next week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. And keep an eye out for our Sunday e-news announcements. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.